Madam Chair,
Yes.
I think we're ready to go.
Okay, great. Let me know when we're live.
We are live.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to yet another September meeting of the Transportation Planning and Environment Committee for September 27th. We have a very full agenda again today. We're going to be discussing the Silver Line LP locally preferred alternative design. We have a presentation on the Silver Line update economic analysis. And then the third is the Charlotte Future 2040 policy map, the fiscal impact analysis. So we're scheduled from 10:30 to 12:30. And I may need to drop off if we go late a few minutes early to catch a flight. So my co-chair, Vice Chair Larkin Eggleston will take over from there. And I think Mr. Winston's going to have to go on just audio as well at some point. So with that, we're going to go ahead and start with item number 2, which is the Silver Line update, the economic analysis, because we do have a guest here today, and that is the consultant from Kittleson and Associates, Jane Lim. So before we get into that, I'm going to have introductions. I'm Julie Eisel, Mayor Pro Tem, serving at large and chair.
Larkin Eggleston, Committee Vice Chair.
Ed Driggs, Committee Member.
Braxton Winston, Committee Member.
She's talking, but we can't hear her.
I'm sorry, I said Mr. Newton might not be on yet, so let's go ahead with staff in the room and then staff, anyone online.
Taiwo Jayoba, Assistant City Manager.
Andy Mock, CAT staff.
Kelly Goforth, CATS. Alicia Osborne, Planning.
Sierra Bratton, Communication and Marketing.
John Lewis, Executive Director, Charlotte Area Transit System.
Lynn Alexander, Charlotte Department of Transportation.
And Jay Rankins with MIG.
Thank you. How about online? Anyone?
John Howard with CATS.
Laura Harmon, Planning.
Catherine Mahoney, Planning.
Lorna Allen, Planning.
Kathy Cornett, Planning.
I'm Matt Prosser with Economic and Planning Systems.
Miles Vaughn, Housing and Neighborhood Services.
Todd DeLong, Economic Development.
Did we get everybody? Okay, well then let's go ahead and we're going to go, as I mentioned, to the Silver Line update, the economic analysis. And am I turning it over to Taiwo or to John?
John.
Okay, thanks, John. Go ahead and take it away.
Very good. Good morning, everyone. Madam Chair, members of the Transportation Committee. The last time we were together, the committee had asked that we take a look into additional issues surrounding the Silver Line, particularly along the 11th Street corridor, specifically looking at the economic impact of the investment in that corridor. Over the period of time, we've had brought on our consulting group that is ready to provide their report on their findings. And I'm going to turn it over to Jane Lynn Yap of Kittleson and Associates, who will walk us through their findings this morning. Is Jane on?
Jane, if you could unmute yourself. Is Jane there?
I don't see Jane's name in the participant list.
I think she thought Andy was going to cover her for the first few slides.
No. Why don't we go on to then, with that, we'll try to fix the technical difficulties we're having in regard to the economic analysis. If we can move on to the Silver Line development analysis. And Andy Mock, our project manager for the Silver Line development, will be given the presentation this morning. The team has been working since the last time we met to continue to refine the analysis and design and engineering of the Silver Line and to get a more defined understanding of station areas, locations, and any alternatives that the team has made in result of input from community and our stakeholder groups. So with that, I'll turn over to Andy Mock.
Yeah, thank you, John, and thank you, TAP Committee, for the time this morning. Just as a reminder, the refined locally preferred alternative that you see on the screen was adopted in April 28th of 2021. It does include 29 miles, 29 stations over 3 counties, and it also includes as a broader program a complementary TOD and rail trail study. It does include aspects of the project within Gaston County and Union County, as well as the broader part of it along within Mecklenburg County. It goes from Belmont along Wilkinson Boulevard through and around Center City, then out Independence, transitioning to Monroe Road through the town of Matthews, and then ends in Indian Trail. Next slide. As John was saying, we have continued working on refining the alternative and the alignment through public engagement and stakeholder engagement. What I'm going to be talking about in the first part of my agenda in the presentation are 5 proposed adjustments or refinements to the locally preferred alternative based on stakeholder feedback and technical analysis. Some of them are relatively minor, some of them are more involved. So I'm going to briefly go through each one of these potential adjustment and talk about our rationale and what the adjustment entails. The first one we're talking about is a minor station adjustment that moved the station from Suttle Avenue to Berry Hill. Next slide, please. So as you can see, the solid dot on the right side is where the adopted alignment is. It is right at Suttle Avenue and Wilkinson Boulevard. Through stakeholder engagement, we had identified, and through our technical analysis, that the station really has very limited access opportunities because this section of Wilkinson Boulevard is starting to convert to the highway section or more of a freeway scenario. So the access would be very limited. The walk-up access would only be able to be achieved by a complex pedestrian bridge structure, which really doesn't mesh well with the communities. So our proposed refinement is to adjust the station back to Moorhead, where you have a natural access point at the signal at Moorhead, as well as a crossing of the railroad at Berry Hill. Next slide. So folks, so we've done this presentation before, have seen our scorecard. We're going to continue that scorecard approach throughout this, these potential refinements. It seems to be effective. So, from a least risk perspective, we really feel like moving the station back to Berry Hill has the least risk because we've received the most public feedback on that. There's not really any distinguishing factors otherwise from a risk perspective. So the feedback, the public feedback seems to be a good one. If you can't get people to the station, that seems like it's a pretty bad concept. So that's from a risk perspective, we feel like moving it to Berry Hill is the way to go. And from a benefit perspective, we feel like moving the station to Berry Hill provides us better opportunities for access, better opportunities for ridership, and better opportunities for redevelopment because the block structure starts to widen out the closer you get to Moorhead. So with that, with the least risk and the most benefit being aligned, we would propose then to shift the alignment from the Suttle Avenue station to Berry Hill. Next slide. I'm just going to roll through these. If anyone wants to jump in with questions, please jump in.
Can I ask a quick question about the last one?
Sure.
Could you tell me what the distances are from the new location of the station to each of the adjacent stations?
I will do. So the,
Pretty close to the one after it.
if you would, would you go back to the last slide, please? One more. So the one to the further to the left is about, I think that's about 500 or 600 feet. We've looked at that analysis, Councilmember Driggs, because we definitely don't want our stations to be too close to each other either. But that's consistent. It's kind of a consistent spacing to our south end stations, which sets a pretty decent precedent for us. And we kind of see the opportunities to develop this area, kind of a similar land use perspective as that in South End. So it's a similar type of dimension of 500 to 600 feet.
And I see that 77 is in between there, but how far is it to the station on the other side?
So that'll be the next one, Councilmember Driggs. If you'd hold for that one, I can get into that next one after that.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. All right, if you'd move up a couple slides, please, to the next. There you go. So this station, next slide, is the potential adding a new station at Summit Avenue. Next slide. This station was something that we actually had in the original plan, was at Summit Avenue. When we started to look at the impacts, potential impacts of the NCDOT interchange improvements and the additional infrastructure necessary for the pipe and foundry, the access to the station became pretty challenging. Not to say that we couldn't overcome it, but we made a recommendation to remove it because the limited access to the station at Summit Avenue. However, we did receive feedback from the Wilmore community and from our TOD and stakeholder teams that there was definitely value in serving the Gold District and the Wilmore communities by having a station in this area, as well as potentially serving the pipe and foundry developments. So we are proposing to add the station back in as a recommendation to serve that. So the spacing there is, Councilmember Driggs, is somewhere around similar 500 to 600 feet. So that's kind of our initial proposal. Does that answer your question, Councilmember?
Thank you, it does, yeah.
All right, great. Next slide. So in this case, in a scorecard, the least risk option, of course, is to not have the station because it's less dependent on all those other infrastructure projects aligning and enabling the infrastructure necessary to serve the station, meaning that you can actually get pedestrians to it. However, we do think that there is benefit in keeping and having the station to serve those communities, and also to continue working with the stakeholders to try to come up with the right access plan to serve the community from the station. So at this point, our proposal is to add the station back into the locally preferred alternative and continue evaluating third-party access in the next phase. So we may come back and decide that we can't overcome the access limitations of NCDOT's interchange improvements or the pipe and foundry infrastructure and decide that it might be removed in the future. But at this point, we didn't want to prejudge that coordination, so we're going to go through that work with our partners and try to figure out a way that we can provide that access. All right, next slide.
Just to be clear, the actual alignment of the rail would not change dependent, regardless of if we put that station there or not, correct?
No, sir. The alignment is the same. It's really whether you're going to add a station. So our geometry is set to facilitate a station or not. It's really about access. And if we can't overcome the access and we can't get people to the station, then we're not going to build the station. But if we can, we think there's value. Great. Okay.
Does the decision about that station reflect any assumptions about development of the pipe and foundry site? I mean, we imagine big things could happen there. Does that affect your decision about placing that station there?
It does, and Councilmember Driggs, we've had a number of conversations with the developers of Pipe and Foundry about that station. At this point, I think they see more value in the Moorhead station, the one that's the next one down. It's in their phase one. That's closer to their phase one development. but that's one of the parties that we definitely want to continue working with. And really, hopefully that the pipe and foundry developers see value in the station and will facilitate the access from their development to it in the future.
Who is the pipe and foundry developer?
I don't know that there is one, is there?
Well, I'm interested to hear if there is one.
Well, there's a rezoning, I guess. There's a rezoning.
Yes,
If the rezoning has been done by Pipe and Foundry themselves, yeah.
So,
Right, they're doing the rezoning themselves, and it's conventional,
Yes.
right?
Yeah, no developer has been identified.
All right, thank you.
Thank you, sir.
all right, next slide, please. So this proposed adjustment is another new station to be added in First Ward. This comes back from a lot of feedback from the community through public engagement as well as through coordination with our TOD team about some potential development benefits along the 11th Street corridor, as well as serving and providing a more premium service to the First Ward and Garden District community. Next slide. So this is really adding a new station at the First Ward, right between Davidson and Caldwell. It would be an aerial station, as this guideway is generally elevated, and it would provide opportunities for direct access from the Garden District and the First Ward communities to a station that's more premium, more proximate, and provides them a better access point than the 11th Street station on the Blue Line. Next slide.
Andy, I'm sorry, could you go back to that slide a second?
Yes.
So you have moved that one slightly?
No, that's a new station proposed, Councilmember Eisel.
And that's but is that at 11th still?
Yep, there's still a station at 11th Street. It's right to the kind of the west of 11th Street, on top of over top of the Blue Line.
Oh, so you would have I'm sorry, I'm not sure if I'm understanding.
Madam Chair, the question I've got might actually piggyback on what you're asking here, if I may. It is two stations here, and I think, to me, there's certainly value in putting the stations proximate to people and giving them even easier access. But in this case, I mean, one of the things that I hear about the Blue Line and about the Gold Line is that the stops are so frequent and so close that it creates such a long ride time for people that it's a deterrent for them riding it. So, I mean, to me, yes, this is certainly closer to, and I think it kind of speaks to Mr. Driggs' point on the Wilkinson one. It's if the stations are going to be so close to each other that you go from being, an eighth of a mile from the station, or a quarter of a mile from the station to an eighth of a mile station. I mean, we can't put it within a quarter of a mile of everybody. I think we can try to put it within a half mile of everybody. I don't know. I don't know how we determine where the balance is that we want to strike between more stations making things 2 or 3 blocks closer to someone to walk versus that's another stop, and each one of those stops adds time to the ride time and makes it less efficient for people to use it as a means of getting to and from where they're going.
So, and I'm Chair, if I may further to that, is that okay?
Sure, go ahead.
Mr. Winston and I are veterans of the New York subway system, and the solution there is you have express trains and local trains. We don't have that option because you can't, you need 4 tracks for that. So I think it is critical that we not create ride times that are stop and go, stop and go, stop and go, like a long haul. This is a 29-mile rail line, and people who want to travel over a substantial portion of that don't want to have to stop 20 times to do it. So I just hope we're sensitive to that. I don't have an answer as such, but when I saw those 2 stations so close together before, it struck me, as Mr. Eggleston says, that we have the prospect of people being less motivated to use it because the connection time, from far away points gets to be too long. Thank you.
And Madam Chair, I know, sorry for the difficulty in navigating this with you being virtual today, but I know Mr. Lewis wants to add to, or wants to speak to that point. Which led me to
So
forget
go
the other
ahead.
thing I was going to
Yeah,
say.
Mr. Lewis, and then we have Mr. Winston.
What's,
I didn't hear that.
I didn't catch that, Madam Chair.
I'm sorry, I said go ahead, John, and then Mr. Winston has a question.
Great, thank you. And these are great questions. I think there are two issues I'd like to clarify. Number one, Councilman Larkin, Eggleston, the comparison, I want to be careful about the comparison between light rail and streetcar. Your observations about streetcar and the amount of stops on there and the length of the trip are absolutely on point, but streetcar operating within traffic is meant to operate at much slower speeds and much more frequent stops. But your point becomes very relevant when we look to phase 3, when we're starting to lengthen that beyond the 4-mile section to more that 10 to 12-mile section, where length of travel and speed of travel will be very important in that. In regard to the alignments here on the Silver Line, and I'm going to point back to the current Blue Line alignment. When we get into suburban areas of the alignment, speed is really the most important thing, and so our stations are more appropriately spread out in the suburban areas of the alignment. But once we get into Center City, like the Blue Line in the south end, the stations are much closer together in order to provide convenient access to more people. And so we have to balance that speed versus ridership demands. And so you will see for these kind of projects, more closely aligned stations in the urban core. Further in the suburban areas, stations will be further spaced apart, and we will have the ability to operate at much higher speeds. And so, Andy, I'll turn it back to you.
Yeah, and one point, and one other additional point that I think that the Kittleson team will get into, there are some development benefits of the First Ward Station that will be articulated a little bit better in the other presentations. So there's some other perspectives to it as well.
And I think, unfortunately, technology, as it's wont to do, we had hoped with the economic development presentation coming first, it would have provided some of the answers to these questions that we had anticipated, but now we're going the other way.
So, maybe that future presentation will shine some more light. But I'm kind of with my colleagues, just implicitly, as Mr. Driggs said, when you live in neighborhoods that are proximate to either express or local stops, part of the culture is walking to the train station a couple of blocks. I would much rather, again, anticipating the future presentation, I would say we need to concentrate on making that connection between the Blue Line and the Silver Line at 11th Street a good transfer point. Thinking about maybe how do you connect other bus routes and or people moving. This is something that we talked about. When the Silver Line does come, being that it's not going through the heart of Uptown, how are we going to move people from the line into the center core and using new technologies and new paradigms of people moving. We might think of the Garden District as maybe a place to kind of put that experiment of moving people from the Garden District to the 11th Street Station, using local transportation options and or walking, but just implicitly, I'm with the colleagues. So, thanks.
Okay. Next slide, please.
Everybody.
Okay, thank you. Good comments all on travel time. It's something that we, in our evaluation, is something we definitely add into our mix of engineering analysis, operational analysis, as well as cost. There's a lot of things that we look at as it relates to these sort of proposals.
Yeah, I think one piece they want to
Next slide, please. Oh, thank you. So from our scorecard perspective, the least risk option we've identified would be to not have the station in First Ward because of the lower cost. The adding an aerial station, there is cost associated with that. Relatively expensive station because it is configured on a bridge, and it does. And by not having it, would avoid some potential environmental impacts. I mean, there was, in some of the feedback we received from the community, everyone was very excited in First Ward about the idea of it, but there were concerns that were raised about noise and light and what comes with the station, right? So that was something that we've heard, but we feel like we can work through those issues. However, in our analysis, we feel like that the benefit of adding the station is really could serve the community better, really be a ridership generator for us, and would also facilitate some of those development improvements that you'll see under the economic development presentation in the future. So, and sorry for that mix-up in order, but our initial recommendation is to add the station to try to seek those benefits.
Hey, Andy, I think we've talked about this before, but how do people transfer from the blue line to the silver line?
That is, there will be there will be infrastructure to accommodate that. I think that detail for how we make that work is something that we're in the practice of working out, and that's something that we'll be working with through the development communities about strategies to integrate some of those access points through adjacent development, and also hard infrastructure to be built, designed by the Silver Line is also part of that mix too. So we're working through those details, and we don't have a solid proposal at the moment for how that would actually occur.
So how far would it be from the closest blue line? I noticed there's one, but what would you actually have to do the way the thing is drawn right now to get from the blue line to the silver line?
The nearest station that would serve it would be at the 9th Street station, and it would be about a 400-foot walk from the 9th Street station to some elevator system, staircase, ramp system to get you to the Silver Line station that would be elevated. So about 1 block walk.
Right. Of course, I'm thinking again about New York, which is subways. They have tunnels to make those connections, so people would have to actually go up and be on the street and walk the 400 feet, which on a rainy day is an obstacle, frankly, to kind of making a connection between those lines. And I think that connection is important. So I'll just point that out and hopefully do some more work on that.
We agree 100%. So we're trying to come up with the right strategies and potentially, that people can walk on the rail trail is one strategy. People might be able to walk through adjacent development to make those vertical connections outside of weather. So I think there's lots of strategies and approaches that we're evaluating, but we 100% share your focus on making that a premium connection. Okay.
Thank you. Yeah.
Next slide, please. So this next one is an alignment, a proposed alignment adjustment. It's relatively minor alignment, but we want to explain the rationale for why we're proposing this adjustment. Next slide. So this area on the left shows the previously adopted locally preferred alternative, which is in the Bojangles Coliseum area adjacent to Independence Boulevard. So the station is in the parking lot of the Boplex in both scenarios, but in the previous scenario, it comes out of the station, heading towards the southeast, and comes in and has a direct impact to the Golden Green Hotel. So that's what was adopted in our April alignment LPA. Since then, we've had a number of conversations with the owner of the hotel as well as potential redevelopers of the hotel, and there's some very intriguing proposals out there to rethink the use of that hotel to include affordable housing and other workforce educational opportunities. Those are somewhat speculative because they're not under construction yet, but it is somewhat intriguing. Also, by avoiding the alignment, it also saves a significant amount of money, and is saved by not having to demolish and remediate a large hotel with the negative impacts that might have. However, by the trade-off is by adjusting it, we are sliding slightly more into the Echo Hills community and would have a potential residential impact in someone's yard. So we would be acquiring some part of a residential property, likely to be a small part of a backyard, but we don't exactly know how the magnitude of that impact yet, something we'll be evaluating. But we feel like the kind of the risk of avoiding the Golden Green is worth the benefit of that affordable housing opportunity. So next slide, please. So with that, and our scorecard summary is that we feel like the risk, again, is kind of worth, the benefit is worth the risk by shifting it a little further into the Fugate area and save a significant amount of costs, and as well preserve the redevelopment opportunities of the Golden Green. So in that case, our risks and benefits are aligned, and then we would propose to shift the alignment towards Fugate Avenue.
Madam Chair. Ms. Larkin,
Yeah.
I just wanted to ask real quickly on this one, how quickly this change, this realignment can be adopted and sort of codified as the new plan, because I know it's actually not highly speculative that there is something in the works right now with that property to be utilized for affordable housing. I think it's an exciting project that helps us achieve another one of our goals and would obviously put these people very proximate to mass transit, which would be great. So for the sake of that deal being able to move forward, how soon could we assure that property owner and a potential future property owner that this change is the new plan?
Our plan is to readopt the locally preferred alternative in January of 2022. We've been talking with the folks, the developers of the site, and shared our timeline. We had a meeting with them last week. They seem to be comfortable with our process. So I feel like we're pretty well aligned with that team. But it would be January 22 for adoption and information to the MTC in November.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Next slide. So this last change is one that's a little more involved, and it's about a configuration of the alignment along Monroe Road. I will try to do my best to quickly go through this. So next slide. The adopted alignment that was adopted in April of 21, it really assumed the light rail would operate sort of like Tryon Street does, where the light rail would be down the median of Monroe Road and operate just like Tryon Street. There's a couple things to note, and that was the alignment that was adopted, way back since 2016, was something similar to that. To note, Monroe Road and Tryon Street are very different roads. The cross section is much narrower on Monroe Road, somewhere about 60 feet of pavement to deal with. No existing median. Tryon Street had a much wider cross section. So one of the things when we first really started to look at what a center running light rail or silver line would look like is really we identified a significant amount of real estate and business impacts with somewhere between 30 and 35 direct business relocations required just from widening perspective, with a significant amount of real estate impacts on both sides of the street, as well as the cost to reconstruct Monroe Road and the cost to relocate all the utilities down Monroe Road. So it's a very impactful alignment decision, and it also causes us to rebuild everyone's driveways, everyone's utility poles, everything on both sides, like we did on Tryon Street. Because of those impacts, we really wanted to look at some other alternatives to see if we could mitigate the impacts and make them better. Next slide. So our first alternative we looked at was running the light rail down the side of Monroe Road on the southern side. When we looked at that from the same lens, the business impacts are similar in that we take somewhere between 30 and 35 businesses directly with the project by running down. But the issue is that we cut off everyone's access, so everyone's driveways would be shut, and we would have to reestablish access some other way. So that second green line that's parallel to the bottom of the slide shows a proposed access road that would serve from the rear side those businesses. However, we think that impact is really just as impactful as the widening, and maybe more so. And it also takes away the opportunities to really redevelop any of those sites, because we would be hitting them twice and really making them very narrow. So it really doesn't solve our business impact problem, but it does allow us to get out of rebuilding Monroe Road and relocating all the utilities, which would have broad community impacts. So we looked at a third option. If you go next slide, please. And this was what we call Monroe Road rear side running. In this case, the light rail would be coming along the back side of the first row of businesses. And so it will allow us to keep everyone's access the same, and it would have significantly less business impacts. There certainly would be business impacts, but they would be less. And it allows us to remediate the access issues and allow for redevelopment of any sites that may be directly impacted by the project, and allows those businesses to continue there with the consistent access. It also achieves the benefit that the first side running option had of not needing to rebuild Monroe Road, creating those community and cost impacts, as well as the utility impacts. This is something that we've been reviewing with our partners in the town of Matthews, as well as major stakeholders and developers along this section of Monroe Road, and everyone seems to be pretty much aligned in this option being a good balance to strike with all the competing interests in this area. So with that, next slide. So in this case, like in our way, we feel like that the least risk option is the rear side running, because it does mitigate those business and property impacts better than the other two options do. And it also creates more benefit opportunity for redevelopment opportunities, and for the ability to reuse those sites and to keep those businesses active today. It's really fundamentally creating a new parallel right-of-way. Some people have said it could, it reminds them of what South End is with their parallel, light rail right-of-way next to a road. I'm not saying this is South End, but it provides an opportunity for some interesting development down the road. So with that, our proposal, because we have the least risk and most benefit are aligned, would be to adopt a rear side running alternative. Okay. All right. Move on. So it's, with those proposed alignments, if the MTC were to adopt that alignment in January, we would have a new proposed refined locally preferred alternative that would look like this map, very similar to the old map, which is some minor adjustments and a couple new stations. All right, next slide. Now to transition to another topic.
What happened to the Levine station shift discussion?
Well, because it's within the town of Matthews, we removed it from the presentation, but I guess it showed up on this one. The next item for topic is really about, it's a conversation about phasing, and this has been brought to council in the past regarding the Transportation Mobility Network and the opportunities to phase the project in such a way to kind of deliver certain aspects of the project sooner, rather than to try to pull off an entire project that's 29 miles in one swoop and maybe try to deliver the project in phases to deliver that to the public sooner. So we wanted to brief the TAP committee about some of our considerations and some of our initial recommendations for what we're proposing. So the question is, why do we need to phase the Silver Line at all? And really the punchline is that there's very limited New Starts funding for any particular phase of the project. So federal funding is very competitive. So we feel like we're putting ourselves in the best position to have the project in smaller bites that can better compete for federal funding, rather than a large mega project that is unlikely to compete for the federal share that we would need. We also feel like that there's a long implementation schedule. Building a 29-mile project, I mean, there's no light rail project in the country that big right now. And just think, in perspective, that is over 3 times larger than either the Blue Line or Blue Line extension. So it's a massive project. So from a schedule perspective, we feel like in general, rule of thumb based on peer cities, it's about 1 year per mile of implementation. So I don't think we want to be building a project for 29 years. And so we think that the max you could do would be 20. So we feel like breaking it up makes a lot of sense from that perspective. We're going to need local funding commitments from other jurisdictions outside of the Metropolitan Transit Commission. So this project, by its nature, exits the MTC in Gaston, Union County. So there is going to have to be, absent that regional commitment or that financial commitment, there's going to have to be some phasing at this point, even though we are keeping that conversation open with those partners. And, that may be adjusted down the road. We'll kind of see how that goes. And there's precedent. So other big phasing implementation agencies such as Denver, Seattle, and Dallas did a similar approach, really from a cash flow perspective, to open the project in segments. All right, next slide. So how do we even look at this? What are the considerations?
I just comment quickly on that. One thing you didn't mention on that list is the sheer construction and engineering capacity to work on a 29-mile project all at once just doesn't exist. So you're going to end up having to ration yourself according to the amount of work that could get done at the same time anyway, and that will then invite the question of the sequence. So I've been asking for some time why we don't have phases here. I'm pleased to see this, and we will have to have an interesting conversation about where we start and what the status is of the outlying areas which are in other counties during this whole process. Because you alluded to this, but the governance around this is, in my mind, not totally settled. We've now got the Alliance working on it, and you've got CARTCO, and you've got MTC, and you have the fundamental funding question. Again, you mentioned the federal thing, but there are a lot of issues. I'd be really happy if we could focus our efforts on a smaller scale, attainable, nearer term project with an understanding about what we intend to do subsequently. Anyway, thank you.
Great comments. Thank you.
Andy, can I just add to that, to what Mr. Driggs said? That was my question is, will the other counties be working simultaneously on trying to get the funding and whatnot for their piece of it? And do you feel as if we are coordinated on that with those counties in lieu of the fact that there is no one organization, one transit authority that can really guide the whole process for all three counties?
So, Madam Chair, thank you. That's a great question. It's an ongoing issue. We have been addressing this in two parallel tracks. Through the MTC, at the MTC level. Second, there's participation through the Council of Government study, Connect Beyond, about what the total region looks like from a transit and transportation standpoint, and how those adjoining jurisdictions can and will address the funding question. And so those conversations are happening. We were just in Gaston County last week with our partners from Connect Beyond, addressing that very question. And those jurisdictions are starting to move forward with how do they address the funding question in a similar type manner that Charlotte and Mecklenburg County have through the Transformational Mobility Network. So those are ongoing and parallel conversations. What we want to make sure we're doing as we continue the design is to ensure that we provide maximum flexibility to, in the design process to meet not only the CATS, city, and county transit goals through this project, but do so in a manner that allows our regional partners to come in at an appropriate time.
Madam Chair, could I comment on that?
Thanks, John. Yes, go ahead, Mr. Driggs.
So my understanding is that we're using the Alliance to kind of centralize or to convene potential parties. Are they playing a part in this as well?
So, thank you, Councilman Rodriguez. Through the economic analysis that they conducted recently, yes, they have been. But we've been engaging them pretty much through that lens, but also through more of playing the advocacy role, because that's not something that we can do. So they've actually been part of the conversation, having meetings with the different chambers outside of Charlotte. So the short answer to that is yes.
So, Ty, do you have any thoughts on how likely it is that ultimately we're going to need some kind of an authority to convene, like to consolidate the region and create a unified governance structure?
I'll let John answer that.
Sure. Great question, Mr. Driggs. That continues. Governance continues to be an important question in this. I will say, I think I'll use the term forefathers, or those elected bodies that developed the Metropolitan Transit Commission, did so in a manner that eyes and anticipates growth in the future as the authority, as the entity brings in additional funding partners. As I mentioned before, the current MTC makeup, the voting members are the funding partners from Mecklenburg County, the city, the county, the towns, and NCDOT. But we have non-voting ex officio members from Gaston County, from Iredell, from Union, that at the point where they become funding partners, they can become voting members. So I think the short term, the MTC is structured in a way that will allow us to bring in additional funding partners. There are other questions from a financial standpoint in regard to debt capacity and where that debt will lie that I think we have to continue to work towards and answer. But I think in the short term, the MTC was created with this in mind.
So I'll just say briefly, I don't want to hold this up here, but I don't think the MTC does all of the things and creates the kind of governance that we're probably going to want, in the sense that we need to have a formal structure that includes Charlotte as the biggest partner, but for example, it might be able to issue the debt. And if you look at Austin and some other cities, the funding for these things is often done. I think Denver works this way too. The funding is done through an issuing entity, and it has a governance structure. So it feels to me like we need to do more work around this. And certainly our early experience, even with the towns, suggests that the structure we have doesn't give them enough of a sense of participation and authority to warrant their committing the funding. And we don't have that commitment from them yet, so I think the question of how we're going to get it is important. Thank you.
And I'll add, Mr. Driggs, that's my concern as well. And John, I know we don't have the answers on it yet, but I almost feel like we've really got to have a separate conversation about this, because as Ed's alluded to, there are other ways to do this that we traditionally, as a city, have not done before in terms of debt funding. And so I really would be interested in that conversation, and I realize we can't have that this morning, but there might be other options that could unlock more potential for us that we really haven't explored. So,
Madam Chair and Councilman Driggs, I think these are all very important and cogent questions. Both the Transformational Mobility Network and Connect Beyond recognize that governance is an important issue, and it is something that we will have to address if ultimately we're going to reach the goals that are established in all of these plans. As was mentioned, I don't have an answer for you today, but it's something that we all recognize we need to address in the coming future.
Thank you.
So back to some of the considerations that we take into account when we came up with our phasing recommendation. I'll just briefly go through this. So in our phasing, each project segment our phasing segment really needs to be able to stand alone and serve a clear project purpose. So it needs to make sense to be a project that we can put forward to seek competitive federal funding. It needs to make sense for how people are going to ride the system. It needs to be cost effective. It needs to really drive ridership, because each one of these project segments or phases will need to compete for federal funds on their own. Project length is something I addressed earlier, which is, we make sure that we're putting forward the projects that we can deliver as quickly as possible to make the most sense from a logic perspective. Also take into account any sort of real estate impacts, risks associated with, and also we need to make sure that we have a strategy for maintenance facility and a storage yard for any phasing scenario, because new maintenance facility will be required for acceptance of new light rail vehicles for the new fleet to serve the Silver Line. Next slide. So just as a kind of a high-level view, some capital cost issues. What you see on the top is from the system update in 2018, and it shows an overall project from the southeast and the west of $6.2 billion, assumed an opening in 2030. So just as a comparison, where we are now at the conclusion of the 5% design through the engineering phase, we're showing a phase A and B, which you see those green lines below, a $5.1 billion for phase A, which we're proposing that to be to the southeast, and I'll get to the rationale for that in the next slide, and a $3 billion for the phase B on the west side, adding up to a $8.1 billion program for both phase A opening in 2036 and phase B opening in 2039. So these are kind of our initial cost considerations, tying that to a scheduled delivery date and consistent with some of the discussions happening with the TMN team. Next slide.
I'm just going to pause for a second here, Andy. And I know Mr. Driggs doesn't like me to cut off anybody, but I'm a little bit concerned with our timing here. Definitely needed 30 minutes more than 30 minutes for that presentation. But we have two more presentations that involve consultants. Our third one has an out-of-town consultant, so I don't know how easy that would be to reschedule them. So I don't want to do that. Can we wrap up this conversation? We'll continue it when we need to do that, but we'll continue it at a later point.
Absolutely. We're happy to do any sort of focused engagement that would help. We could do a pared down version of this presentation to we come back to TAP, or we could have other meetings directly with council folks, as probably wants.
Madam Chair, could he just roll through whatever slides he still had without comments, so we can see what the rest of the presentation
Okay, I just asked if you could, hold our comments, and I am absolutely happy to schedule another meeting to keep doing this because it's important stuff, but go ahead.
Okay, all right, next slide. So the difference in the cost, when to kind of take a minute to kind of explain why that rationale.
In response to the Pro Tem's comment, I meant literally just put each slide up for a couple of seconds.
Okay.
Let us see what the remainder of the presentation looked like so we can get on to the next segment.
Okay, yep. So reason for the cost, we have some capital infrastructure planned. We also changed an implementation schedule as well as increased escalation rate. Next slide. So that all takes us to a baseline phasing scenario of phase A being to the southeast, and that goes from Charlotte Gateway Station to CPCC Levine. And then phase B would be to the west from Charlotte Gateway Station to I-485. And there are all other terminus locations being evaluated with the financial team. And that summary shows our initial proposed phasing from a staff perspective.
Are we going to get this deck? Can we get the deck?
Sure.
Yeah.
And so this shows some of our upcoming engagement. We do have a Matthews Town board meeting tonight, as on top of this TAP meeting. We have public meetings, public virtual meetings on October 11th and 20th, and the MTC information in November, MTC action in January. That's it. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Andy. Appreciate it.
Sorry we ran long.
Thank you. Appreciate it. So the next presentation we'll jump into is our economic analysis. And John, I'm going to let you go ahead and make introductions right there.
Very good. Thank you, Madam Chair. As I mentioned earlier, the last time we met, Council had requested a better understanding of the economic development trade-offs of a Silver Line alignment along 11th Street. Understanding economic development benefits are critical, of course, as it is woven through many of the conversations that we've had. And we want to make sure that our city investment supports our larger community and the betterment of our residents' and workers' quality of life. We also know that economic benefits are key when our federal partner, FTA, is evaluating transit projects across the nation. Today, we wanted to share our analysis on this topic, and right now, I'll turn it over to Jane Lim Yap, our project manager of the Silver Line, for the Silver Line TOD study, to go over the results of their findings. Jane?
Thank you, John. Can everyone hear me all right?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, thank you. So yeah, well, happy to share some high-level ideas and also take some questions after. Our presentation outline, we want to look at the economic impact analysis based on the station area. That's where we really want to focus on. And then look at some recent case studies of transit-oriented development and understand what the impact is on property taxes. We also have a few slides to just share some vision from the station area planning workshops that we've done in the July outdoor workshops. And then also understanding construction impacts also in the trade-offs of different alignments. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, we are really looking at an understanding of economic impact really from the station reach standpoint. The alignment obviously overall has an influence on economics, but really the influence is where stations connect to residents, connects to job. And so if we look at the alignment along 11th Street versus along Trade Street, the 11th Street station reach from a half-mile, 5-minute walk perspective, from a quarter-mile, half-minute perspective is about 319 acres, and on Trade Street about 289 acres. And that's because both stations are in Uptown, have a robust station street network that's serving both stations. So the difference is not that much in terms of station reach. However, if we drill down more closely, next slide, please, in looking at, what does it mean in terms of benefits and impacts to economics from the city's perspective. We looked at tax-exempt parcels for both station areas, and these are the parcels that are exempt because they're of government use or institutional uses, and these are likely properties that are not going to have significant change in the long term. So not only is it not producing immediate impacts from a property tax perspective, it also will likely not change into more density or a mixed use standpoint. So on 11th Street, we have 64 parcels totaling about 114 acres, and on Trade Street, about 75 acres totaling about 118 acres. So again, not significantly different. The next slide shows underutilized parcels, and from a market economic standpoint, what we would consider underutilized is when the land value of those properties are increasing such that it actually reaches a threshold that the property on top of it is 40% or less of the total value of the whole site. And in terms of the rules of thumb from our market and economics experts, this is when property owners will most likely have the propensity of redeveloping properties. So this is where we see a little bit more difference between the two station areas. Along 11th Street, we see 121 parcels totaling 81 acres. And on Trade Street, we see 90 parcels totaling about 51 acres. Comparing the two, we have 30 more acres of underutilized properties that could potentially redevelop into transit-oriented development. And, just a quick understanding, these are 23 football fields of more space that's ripe for development, much of it north of the Brookshire Freeway, but there are also properties that are immediately south of the freeway. Next slide, please. So we looked at some recent development just to, what I've shown in the previous slides are in theory, this might happen, but we also wanted to see what in reality has happened along the blue line and draw lessons and comparisons from that. So this first example is the rail yard in South End. And we wanted to understand what the property tax revenue changes from pre-development before it was redeveloped into transit-oriented development, into mixed-use higher density, to post-development, here most recently from the 2019 records, tax records. So that pre-development number, it used to be a parking lot and some industrial land uses, a warehouse, and that is not a typo. The pre-development property tax on that site was $984. The post-development property tax, annual property tax on that site is $1,121,000. And of course, it's a successful mixed-use development. If we look at what that means in terms of per acre, in terms of annual property tax change, it's about $400,000 per acre that annually that the city is receiving on that property. Next slide. So another example that we looked at is the Stonewall Station development next to the Stonewall Station Blue Line Station in Uptown. And pre-development, it was receiving contributing $902,000 to property taxes, and post-development, it's $4,200,000. And we know that the site itself of this development has changed because we have increased the property with the redevelopment in the area where it used to be interstate ramps and some retaining walls that opened up for more development opportunity. It's the site changed from about 3 acres to 7.3 acres. So, one could likely assume that maybe, we could double or a little bit more double the size if we develop it in a straightforward way. But we could see that the property value has increased so much that the property tax increased by more than that twofold value that we're expecting. And so the change in property tax per acre is about $280,000. So with those two examples, one showed about $400,000 per acre of change in annual property tax. This one showed about $280,000 per acre change. If you go to the next slide, if we just apply, again, this is applying some real numbers to what could happen in the future. If we apply that range of potential property tax change to both of the 11th Street and the Trade Street station area, the 81 acres that we have in the 11th Street would yield about 24 million right now. The potential additional yield that it could have is about 20 to 35 million if we consider that value increasing. For Trade Street, the 51 acres would yield currently about 15 million, and the additional yield could be about 15 to 20 million. So a quick conclusion to this is that the 11th Street Station area does have an additional potential to unlock about $5 to $15 million more in terms of annual property tax. And most of this would be the underutilized properties within walking distance of the station. There's a lot of this next slide shows a lot of the questions that you all have had in the first presentation that Andy showed of First Ward and the 11th Street Station. And I just wanted to note that the previous numbers that I've shown is an apples-to-apples comparison. We did not include any additional economic benefits that First Ward would have. It was just one station compared to one station between 11th Street and Trade Street. But we put together some visualization as part of the station area plans, and just wanted to share some of those. The next slide, so this slide, can you go back one slide, just shows the existing conditions as you can see looking west on Uptown. and 11th Street on the one side of Brookshire and 12th on the other side. The next slide shows how that light rail line could be built parallel to 11th Street. So on the far end is this 11th Street station that would connect and be a transfer station to the Blue Line, and the First Ward station kind of on the foreground. Aside from the potential that Andy had explained related to the First Ward station, serving the First Ward neighborhood and the multifamily uses that are around that area, as well as catalyzing some of the underutilized properties on the south side of the Brookshire Freeway. This is also where the freeway dips down a little bit, and a longer term, potentially a moonshot vision of bridging the Brookshire Freeway and connecting the two sides of the freeway could be another additional benefit of First Ward. But this is just one of the thoughts that came out of the workshop that obviously Council has previously seen and discussed also as part of the Center City Partners presentations. The next slide shows an eye-level view of what 11th Street could look like, with the First Ward station being on the foreground, the light rail alignment crossing 11th Street, and then on the far side is the 11th Street station and the Blue Line connection. Next slide shows another more zoomed-in view and the plan view level of what these two stations and the configurations could look like.
Jane?
Go ahead.
I'm sorry, can I interrupt you a second? What, on the last slide, what did you mean by the configuration of the blue line with the silver line?
Go back one slide. We can't quite see it, but the 11th Street is obviously more elevated than the 12th, than the station. So there's the connection that could happen. And I could quickly share in this next slide some of the potential infrastructure connections that could happen. You could see this block between College and Blue Line as the area where development could, or a civic space could be functioning as the connection between the Blue Line and Silver Line. So that 400 feet horizontal difference, as well as the vertical difference, could be something that's integrated into a landmark development, both from a public space standpoint as well as a development standpoint. And this is something that obviously could be explored a lot more with the development community, and we have some ideas also on engaging the ULI on that later on that I could share. But this is, we have some additional park could look like, showing some of the ramp impact or effect and public park could look like, showing some of the ramp impact or effect and public art. So again, this plan for sure. We looked at the number of households. There are 1,600 households that has direct access to the First Ward station, about 8,000 jobs. Obviously, some of those are overlapping between the two stations. But we were also concerned about kind of the equity impacts of making sure that we are serving some of the affordable housing and zero-car households in the First Ward area. And we've looked at about 16% of the residents in the station area are below poverty in terms of income. The next slide,
So, Jane, I'm sorry, I'm just really confused on this. That 11th Street stop, if you wanted to get off, and that's the Silver Line, even though it's colored blue, right?
The purple box, I apologize to this slide, that's the station platform. The Blue Line is north-south, obviously, and that is the Blue Line.
Blue Line.
Yeah. The Silver Line is running in this slide kind of east-west, but really it's along 11th Street, and then it crosses 11th Street to the other hatch area. That's also purple. That would be the First Ward station. So the blue line and the silver line will be intersecting right between College and the blue line. That purple box rectangle is the representation of the platform.
So on the blue line, we would be, I mean, what's new here is that what we were talking about before is you'd have to get off at 11th Street off the silver line and walk to 9th Street for the blue line.
Correct.
But now you're saying you would add a stop on the blue line?
No. There's no.
11th?
There's this block that's between 10th Street and 11th Street is what we're saying that's a very important block that could provide that integration of the two stations, because that's the block that bridges the two stations. We're not recommending a new station on the blue line. Apologize for confusing.
So people would have to walk through the neighborhood from 11th Street to get on to the blue line?
They would walk one block on the rail trail or integrated through the development of the building, kind of like I know in some cities we have the architecture itself linking a couple of the transfer points of the station, and so that's one possibility. We're not saying that that's the only possibility.
Okay, I'm still concerned about that one. I can't really envision people walking through a neighborhood to get to another stop or even on the rail trail, but if there's an elevated connection between the two, that would be one thing, a dedicated connection, but this...
Right, as probably could share some other visualization that could look at that connection more closely.
Okay, go ahead.
So aside from next slide, please. Aside from looking at the immediate economic impacts of, the trade-offs between 11th Street and Trade Street alignment, we also wanted to understand what the construction impacts are, because as, we talked about phasing just now, we know that this is a project that could have a significant duration for construction, and wanted to understand what this means. So we, at a high level, looked at the businesses, the number of residents, and large developments along either corridor. And because 11th Street has more underutilized properties and that we don't have as much, there's potentially lower impact to existing businesses. Whereas on Trade Street, we have a lot of significant uses along there that could be impacted during construction. The other point, and we put down the AADT or just the traffic volume numbers here, just to understand, we would have to close down some of the streets in terms of during the construction in the uptown areas. And we looked at 11th Street having 7,500 cars per day, and then on Trade Street between 10 and 13,000 AADT. So not only, next slide, not only is the impact immediate in terms of the actual buildings and uses there, the idea of putting the alignment on trade would also mean, building the tunnel underneath it. And we looked at a comparison of what this means also in terms of the impact on the network connectivity of the streets in the uptown grid. And this is obviously not Trade Street, but this is in the University District area where we do have that tunnel along Tryon, and the coming down to get to grade and or below is about 800 feet length, and also which means we will be restricting the cross street access, so both pedestrians, bicyclists, but also vehicular access, because of the actual tunnel kind of dipping down and coming back up. Where we have our typical uptown block is 400 feet, so about 2 or 3 streets on either side would be impacted. And I mentioned earlier that we have, next slide, we have some ideas, kind of to focus in and drill down even more in understanding the economic impacts and, trade-offs from the development community as well, and begin exploring some ideas with the ULI on additional analysis So they have, the ULI is a great partner, and they have a menu of tools. One is a project analysis session that really is a quick kind of a precursor to a more in-depth workshop and conversation in engaging the potential sponsors, stakeholders, and defining the details of the subsequent technical assistance. So this we thought could be a potential activity. And then the next slide shows the potential for a more in-depth multi-day service panel. The ULI offers this advisory service panel that we could look at that connection that we've been talking about between 11th Street and the Silver Line transfer station, what this means to station area development and development opportunities, bringing key partners and landholders to the table. And then, we've also identified some potential study partners to be the city CATs, the Center City partners, the county as well, as we know they're the properties that are around the area, and looking at those key sites, the Hall Marshall site and the adjacent blocks, potential for that signature public space or development opportunity with the two lines connecting, and development of the CATS bus operation, or what the future of that could be. And I think with that is the end of my presentation, and happy to answer any questions.
Madam Chair.
Yeah, go ahead, Mr. Edison.
Thank you. Thank you, Jane. My question is on slide 8. Thank you. And I hope I can ask this in a way that's clear what I'm trying to get at, but you addressed it. I'm just not sure I heard you correctly, or that I fully understood the comparison here. The potential to unlock $5 million to $15 million in annual property tax with the addition of, well, this was comparing 11th Street to Trade Street.
Correct.
I mean, the Trade Street alignment is basically off the table now, right? So I didn't even know that was a point of discussion.
Yes, we have been asked to look at other alignments through Uptown, anywhere from Trade to 7th Street. And so rather than having multiple options of this, we've kind of tried to illuminate that. If you look back to the other slides, it was kind of an amoeba of a large service area that incorporated both Trade and 7th.
Does this, and maybe this is a different conversation, but I think what was being asked in the first presentation about the potential first ward station in addition to the 11th Street station that's already planned, does this anywhere speak to, or can you speak to, what you believe to be the potential gain by having the first ward station in addition to the 11th Street station? Is that in a different presentation, or is that just not something we've studied yet? Because I've mostly made peace with the idea that this is going to be on the north end of town, and the prospects of tunneling through up Trade Street are horrifying to me. But I do think that economic analysis around some of these potential additional stations we're talking about, specifically the 11th Street and the First Ward station, would be useful information. The cost of adding the station and the potential to unlock more development, because I would assume that much of the development along the line in and right around Uptown is going to occur regardless of whether someone's an eighth of a mile from a station or a quarter of a mile from a station. Has that work been done yet, or are we going to before we make a final decision on adding additional stations?
So let me make sure. I believe the area that we examined on 11th Street, that total study area would include the location of the additional station. And so I think broadly, the analysis that is done.
These numbers include
These numbers would include that area. Now, I'm going to ask
supposing that there would be both stations we've discussed.
both stations. Now, this study is looking at the opportunity, not specifically what that additional station would look like. That's what the subsequent studies that we're talking about, bringing in ULI and others to help us dig deeper in this. This presentation you got today was just a broad comparing one area of the city to another area, not necessarily station locations.
And if I may add, John, the numbers that we saw on slide 8 are just purely on 11th Street, not on First Ward. Obviously, on slide 12, you will see that the two station areas do overlap,
right.
But there are residents and some potential underutilized property that's not captured in one versus the other. And we can have some of those detailed numbers of that analysis that and Andy just showed a high level presentation of. This presentation was really comparing the alignment location and what the economic impacts could be versus 11th and First, the addition potential for First Ward. And
Jane, on these on this Venn diagram here, is this a quarter-mile radius circle around each station?
yes.
Thank you.
Okay, if we don't have other questions,
Madam Chair, I have my hand up.
oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Drakes, go ahead.
Okay. I thought it was worth emphasizing that on council, our decisions are not driven by the prospect of property tax. And I say that because I often deal with citizens who suspect that our rezoning and our planning processes are a revenue exercise for us. We need to be mindful of the fiscal implications, but our highest priorities are achieving the best outcome for the public. So I just want to, I hope we all agree on that, want to deflect any perception that this conversation indicates that we're all about trying to maximize revenue. I'm curious about the whole methodology here, and I agree with Mr. Eggleston. I thought that Trade Street was kind of off the table, but it seems to me our highest priority ought to be to provide service where people are, and not install service where we think they might be in the future, because the truth is we have an existing base of potential riders and people who could benefit along that Trion's, the initial, the alternative, call it, that's being offered here. So I just think it's a little odd, given how highly developed and densely populated the other channel would be, that we prefer to go someplace where we think we can drive development rather than serve the people who are already there. I would also mention that the prospect for incremental development is obviously greater in a less developed area than it is in a highly developed area. So that kind of skews that conversation, that comparison in any case. If this is off the table, I'm not sure why we're having this conversation, but I just have a concern about methodology here. And what I would also point out is the slides as they're presented do not appear to take into account the development that will happen anyway, i.e., all of these things are not utterly driven. You don't have a zero alternative here. So I expect there would be a great deal of growth and development along the proposed alignment anyway. And therefore, if we really want to assess the impact of rail, we need to talk about the deltas. How different is it that there's a rail line there versus not having a rail line there? Certainly what we're seeing around Charlotte is a huge amount of growth away from rail lines, as well as the incremental growth that is driven by, say, the Blue Line. And I expressed before, and I say again, I am concerned about the fact that we have these lines intersecting, and we have an awkward connection. And to me, this is similar to questions about the airport, frankly, elsewhere, where you have the opportunity to serve the airport, and now we're kind of driving by the airport, and there's some not very well spelled out plan to create a people mover or a connection for passengers. Anyway, and last comment, to me, economic analysis has a sort of macro dimension. So what are we talking about, in terms of the differences in job creation, for example, as a result of the choices we make here? And again, I think this choice has already been made, but when we're talking about economic analysis, I think things like that are part of it. How is our GDP affected? How are jobs affected? And one of the things that's worth noting about the Blue Line development is it has been off target in terms of our priority to make this transit option accessible to lower income people. Most of the development that has occurred in South End has been high rent type of residential properties and commercial sites. So there is a broader kind of interpretation of impact that I'm not hearing yet. I think this is a good conversation, and it provides a basis for offering comments like this. But in my mind, there are still a lot of questions that aren't answered. I guess I'll just put it that way. Thank you.
Thank you. And Jane, I really appreciate the presentation. I think we just, as a committee, we have to work with staff to get a better understanding and get our concerns addressed. I share some of the comments that the concerns Mr. Driggs just expressed and what Mr. Eggleston has expressed. So I'm not sure we can, you can answer those now, but I appreciate the presentation. And if we've asked our questions for today at least, I think we do need to move on. So Mr. Lewis, are we good there to move on to the?
Yes, that concludes our presentations for today.
Okay. Thank you very much. And thank you, Jane.
Thank you,
John. With that, we're going to move into the Charlotte Future 2040 policy map, the fiscal impact analysis. I know we've got an hour budget and we have about 45 minutes. So Alicia and Jay and Matt, I apologize for that. But if you can maybe shorten it a little bit, we do want to try to get in as much as possible. So
Yep.
Thank you.
And thank you, Madam Chair and committee members, for the opportunity to continue our discussions about the implementation of the Charlotte Future 2040 Comprehensive Plan. Again, thank you all for your approval and adoption of the plan in June 21st of this year. And we want to today share an abbreviated version of the conversation around the fiscal impact and economic analysis. There was part of the discussion during the comp plan that received a lot of attention around providing housing diversity. And that is goal number 2 of the plan. And we will provide some information about that particular policy and how the plan will do that. And I'll quickly turn it right over to our consultant, and we'll jump right into the duplex, triplex, and likeliness analysis that talks about goal number 2 and how that, how we plan to implement that and the impacts of that policy on Charlotte's future. Matt Prosser, if you can skip to the next slide. That one, perfect.
Can you all hear me fine? Yes.
Yes.
Actually, I think we'll do one more down. All right. So we had a number of things we're going to walk through with you today, but given our timing, we're going to focus primarily on this duplex, triplex likeliness analysis. This really is an evaluation of potential impacts of Goal 2.1 in the comprehensive plan. And also is something we wanted to discuss with you before the draft UDO comes out. We can come back to you with the other discussions in terms of fiscal impacts at another time and bring you up to speed with those as the policy map continues to be developed. So next slide, please. So as you remember, within the comprehensive plan, we had 2 goals that focused on housing. We did this intentionally to highlight the importance in the community. Goal 2 focused on providing housing diversity and supply, whereas Goal 3 focused more on accessibility and affordability of housing. Now, policy 2.1 was a part of goal 2, and its goal was to create the opportunity for more housing within our existing neighborhoods by allowing duplexes and potentially triplexes and ADUs on single-family lots. And so that is the plan policy that's driving first sort of the mapping of place types, and specifically the neighborhood 1 place type in the policy map process. And ultimately, this policy will be implemented through the UDO in the development of 6 zone districts, as you can see on the right, which will guide the parameters for what can occur on lots within neighborhood 1 place types. Next slide. And really the goal of 2.1 was to increase housing opportunities. Really, recognizing that as a community that's growing rapidly, we're growing in employment at a much greater rate than we are in housing. We need to create an opportunity to increase our overall housing supply everywhere that we can, especially since the city is largely built out. And so 2.1 is one of many policies within the plan that aim at increasing housing opportunity. And again, I said that it's through allowing for potentially duplex and triplex units on any single-family lot, as well as ADUs. And while this policy is enacted, we do realize that there is an impact on existing neighborhoods, and realizing we need to respect the established neighborhood character. And that's really where a lot of the work of the UDO will come in within these zone districts to help define the lot sizes, the setbacks, the parking, and height and other parameters that are needed to make sure that we're creating building forms that fit within the character, but still allow for more than just one unit on a lot. So next slide. So we, reacting to some feedback that you all have provided, we completed an analysis to look at what's potential likeliness that lots would be redeveloped from a single-family home to a duplex or a triplex, to get a sense of sort of what the potential change is and what implications we might see in terms of property values and affordability. So to do this, we looked at both national and international case studies, the studies that we could find related to upzonings and their impacts on property values and affordability. We evaluated those. And then also do an analysis of the existing conditions in Charlotte. Next slide. So as I mentioned, we did a number of evaluations of different case studies, or I should say studies, economic studies that were completed related to the impacts of upzoning. And I will say there aren't a ton out there, to be honest with you. While the idea of upzoning to create greater density in certain areas like transit areas and others has been around for a while, tracking the longitudinal impacts of those changes, there aren't a lot of resources for us to rely on. So we did find studies looking at Chicago, Denver, Portland, New York City, and then also one international case study in Auckland, New Zealand. And what we looked at was what was the zoning change, what's the impact on housing supply, remembering that our goal with this policy is to increase housing supply and opportunity. Also looked at the impact on property values, and then the impact of housing affordability overall for the community. So what we found is in communities where they upzoned or were trying to create more housing supply by allowing for greater development potential, there was most often an increase in housing supply. And so this tactic, its economic goal primarily is to increase housing supply, and it's fairly successful in that application. What we did find is that there is some impact on property values. Specifically, the value of lower value parcels did tend to increase to match the development potential that was now possible on the site. So if a lot that was zoned for perhaps 1 or 2 units previously is now zoned for 4 or 5, the underlying value of that parcel increases to a point to reflect that potential change in value. We also found, though, that the overall impact on housing affordability, specifically average rental rates and average home prices within these communities, were not substantially impacted. And there were not perhaps measurable or attributable changes to the upzoning. And so while the value of certain parcels did increase, we didn't find that neighborhoods, the overall average home prices or average rental rates in neighborhoods went up substantially as a result. One specific analysis that we performed was within Denver, evaluating changes to their zoning code. They actually enacted a new zoning code in sort of the 2010 timeframe. And the result was some single-family lots had an increased development potential, whether that's a larger building or the potential for multiple units, while other lots had a decreased development potential, or downzoned. And in most cases, that meant just a smaller building form and not the ability to do 2 units. And what we found is that the change in home price in those neighborhoods, the average home price in those neighborhoods, was roughly the same. And so both neighborhoods continue to have strong growth in average home prices, but there wasn't an exacerbation or an increase due to the upzoning or to the downzoning. And so, I mean, the biggest takeaway being using upzoning to create more housing supply most often results in the market responding and providing more housing opportunity. There are potential impacts for increases in property values on some owners, specifically lower property value owners. Next slide. So in terms of looking at Charlotte specifically, we developed a methodology to evaluate all the single-family lots within the community. And first, we wanted to look at what the physical capacity for change is. So based on the parameters that are going to be proposed in the UDO for lots within those single-family districts, we wanted to see what the potential for a lot to accommodate an additional unit was. So it's their physical capacity. And then next, we wanted to look at the market support. And we did this by looking at 2 different considerations. First was achievable home prices in neighborhoods, both for new attached units, but also all types of units in a neighborhood. And then comparing the difference between a parcel's value and what the ultimate affordable home price is, sort of that delta, has a big impact on what the feasibility of development is. And we also considered other impediments to redevelopment. So I'll walk through each of these. Next slide. First, physical capacity. What we did is we looked at 2 things. We looked at the width of a parcel. Is the parcel wide enough to accommodate a duplex unit? Realizing that the duplex unit will have to provide parking and access to parking that is behind the building and not in front. And also needing to have a unit that is wide enough, especially if they're not stacked units, to provide an actual market attractive unit. And so we were looking for parcels that had a minimum of 50-foot width, and then potential 40-foot width if they're stacked units. So we looked at it both ways, realizing that if they're stacked, they may be less attractive to the market, but it's easier to accommodate those into narrower parcels. And then the second thing we looked at is the parcel big enough to allow for an increase in the building space within it, realizing there is lot coverage requirements within the proposed zone districts. And so we had to make sure that a parcel could allow for a lot to, the lot is large enough to allow for 3,000 square feet at minimum for 2 units. And so we performed this analysis on all the lots, and what we found is most lots, based on the design of UDO and the configurations that they have currently, can accommodate additional units. Only 4% of lots we deem to have a potential constraint. And not necessarily saying that they couldn't, but it might be harder for them to configure that lot to have 2 units. And so really the takeaway here is that there isn't a mini physical capacity limitation. The biggest limitation in our mind is the market support. So next slide. So to evaluate market support, we created a simple development pro forma for a prototypical duplex unit on what we think is the most affordable potential lot. And so what we found in our pro forma is most typically land costs are at least 15% of the total cost of a project. The construction cost is 65%, if not more, of the total cost of the unit. And equity or the profit needed to develop that lot and make it attractive to developer was around 20% in a typical consideration. So the biggest takeaway there being that construction costs really drive the feasibility of doing multiple units on a lot. So you have to sell a duplex unit at a high enough price point to overcome those construction costs, which can be a barrier in many areas. So we developed a typical lot, about, a typical unit size, I should say, 1,500 square feet heated as sort of a minimal example. By comparison, new units throughout the city that were found were about 1,900, so this is relatively small duplex unit. We have an estimated construction cost of $200 per square foot. Again, that 15% land cost of a minimal, and then accounting for at least 20% of the cost of capital or equity, and then also profit for the redevelopments. And so what we found is that using these parameters, that we needed projects needed to have a land cost that was at least 50% or less of the total revenue that could be generated for 2 units. And then we also estimated that a new duplex unit would have to be sold for at least $450,000 to be able to overcome the construction costs related to doing a redevelopment of an existing single-family. Next slide. So based on these parameters, we developed 4 different scores. We looked at lots that had a presence of home sales over $450,000 within their neighborhood. We also looked for lots that had new attached home sales over that $450,000 neighborhood, so limit in their neighborhood. So really what we're trying to identify here is neighborhoods that can support that high of a price point. The next is we looked at a comparison between the land value or the existing parcel value and what the highest achievable price point for an area would be. So we looked at all home sales within each area and compared the land value of each parcel to what we thought the highest achievable price point was for that neighborhood based on MLS sales data. We also looked at what the highest achievable price point for 2 duplex units that have been sold in those neighborhoods would be compared to land value, and identified lots that had a land value of 15% or less of that. So next slide. So that created 4 potential scores. So each parcel could have a score from 0 or 4, depending on whether or not they met those criteria. And this map on the right reflects the findings of that analysis. So parcels that are in the darker purples, the purple or dark purple, are parcels that we find are more likely to support feasible redevelopment from 1 unit to 2 units, based on the market's support, whether that's the presence of home sales that are high enough to support the construction cost, or the parcel value is low enough compared to the achievable price points to be a feasible redevelopment. So what we found was 6% of all the single-family lots have the highest score of 4. Those are in that very dark purple-blue color, primarily sort of to the south of Uptown. Next, we looked at lots that had a moderate or high likeliness score, so 3 or 4. 18% of lots had that score. And then we also overlaid, in gray you can see on this map, the vulnerability to displacement from the comprehensive plan. So these are the areas that we found in the comprehensive plan and the equitable growth framework to be the most vulnerable to displacement. And what we found was 7% of the lots had either a moderate or high likeliness score, at least on current conditions. And so now it seems there isn't a potential impact under current conditions, or major impact, I should say, for these vulnerable areas. But I will say this is a current snapshot. As market conditions change over the next 5-10 years, those can change the impact on these vulnerable areas fairly quickly, depending on what market trends occur and what investments we make in our community. And so it's a realization, or important to note, that efforts to potentially mitigate some impact to displacement and rising property values in these vulnerable areas should be a focus, as well as the efforts to increase housing supply. Next slide shows the same map overlaid with demolition permits for single-family homes in 2020. And what it's illustrating is a lot of the demolition activity that has occurred in the neighborhoods in Charlotte pretty closely, if not exactly, overlays with the areas we think there's a higher likeliness for feasible redevelopment. And so this really was reassuring and showing that the areas we think are most likely are actually the areas that the market is already seeing potential in as well, even without the changes that 2.1 has been proposing. So next slide. So in summary, national case studies found upzoning can produce an increase in housing supply, realizing that's our goal. It's likely that the land value will increase on certain parcels to match the greater development potential. But overall, we did not find that the average cost of housing, whether that's sales prices or rental rates, was measurably impacted in upzoned areas versus not upzoned areas. In terms of Charlotte's conditions, physical capacity isn't a major limitation to a lot having 2 units versus 1. It's more the market feasibility. And parcels need a combination of both low value and high enough supportable sales prices to be feasible. And we found that about 6% of lots had a high likeliness. There's also the consideration of restrictive covenants that can limit potential, whether that's HOAs, CC&Rs, and for certain neighborhoods that may not allow duplexes. And those are very tough to definitively pin down throughout the community, but it is a limitation that would prevent this. So next slide. So I think I'll stop here if you want to go back actually one slide, sorry, and take questions and comments from the council members.
Okay, do we have any hands up or questions?
I have a question. Madam Chair, it's Ed.
Yes, go ahead.
All right, thank you. You mentioned that there was 7% in the vulnerable communities on one of your slides. Do you know what percentage that represents of the total area in vulnerable communities? Like that's 7% of the anticipated duplex and triplex development, right? But what percentage does that represent of the total area of the vulnerable communities?
It's 7% of the single-family lots within the vulnerable communities. In terms of what that is, percentage-wise of all of the lots within the vulnerable to displacement areas, I'm not certain.
Because that would be a critical thing for us to try to assess, one of the possible unintended consequences. I was struck by the fact that you didn't seem to find that the cost of housing actually benefits from these higher density programs. So the supply does. The real question is whether the rate of additional housing supply keeps pace with the rate of growth of demand for housing. And if you had changed those relative quantities, you would expect to see a shift in cost up or down. But it looks like from the slide you showed us that you wouldn't anticipate that there is a benefit in terms of falling housing costs. And in particular, $450,000 on up could mean that in the vulnerable neighborhoods, we're seeing low-cost housing displaced by more expensive units. Is that an incorrect conclusion?
Well, I would say, no, I wouldn't say it's incorrect. I would say that what the policy goal is and what upzoning does is to create housing supply, to your point, to match with the growing demand of housing. I think the application here on single-family lots is one of many efforts within the comp plan to try to increase housing supply. And realizing that as a community in a metro area, we're growing in employment at a greater rate than we are in housing. So trying to create multiple opportunities for us to increase diversity of housing and the access to housing for all residents is something that was a major component of the comprehensive plan. In terms of the case studies we looked at, the one that did show an impact was in Auckland. They actually found that there was a depreciation in cost for higher density units as a result of the upzoning. And so and that was more specific to all types of upzoning in Auckland and really the allowance for higher density units. And so at a more macro level in that study, they did find that, but in terms of the U.S. case studies, the specific zoning zoning change that was evaluated was not having an impact in terms of increasing housing costs for residents compared to areas that weren't upzoned, if that makes sense. I would think, in essence, what you're trying to do is trying to increase housing supply so that you're not exacerbating the already growing housing costs and demand within the community. And so if we were to limit housing supply more, there is potential that the rate of housing costs would grow up higher. None of the studies were able to necessarily get at what the potential opportunity costs would be related to being more restrictive. So that's something we can try to explore. But yes, it doesn't necessarily, this policy is not necessarily going to make housing costs go down. The policy will allow for more housing to be built throughout the community.
So, Matt, I wanted to tell you I appreciate the lifestyle statement that your pool cues make in the background there. Just aside, but that's very cool. I get the general proposition that liberalizing land use would be conducive to more supply. So that's the broad sort of notion. The devil here to me is in the details, like which land is being liberalized and what's there now, and does it play out the way we want? A conversation we've already had was about neighborhood character overlays. I regard those as potentially a major escape valve, if you will, from unintended consequences of 2.1, because as I understand it, that allows people in a community of interest to apply for special provisions to preserve the character of their neighborhood. You didn't look at that at all or try to get a sense of how many applications there are likely to be or how big an impact that could have on the standalone effect of 2.1?
No. In our mind, fairly speculative to be able to give you real definitive feedback.
Because one of my biggest concerns during the whole process was we need escape valves. We need sort of the ability to be flexible in situations where the strict application of 2.1 doesn't make sense, and that applies also to 10-minute walkable neighborhoods, which is certainly in great areas in my district would make no sense at all. So I guess thank you for that analysis. Are you still doing more work, or is this kind of your outcome at this point?
We're specifically looking at this likeliness. This is what we had proposed putting together, but if there are additional questions, we are happy to consider and evaluate more. There's additional economic analysis that we were going to go over today with you as well that we are continuing to perform, both related to the policy map, but also ultimately the UDO. We're doing an economic impact analysis related to the UDO. That will kick off once the UDO draft is out, and my understanding is the end of this month, early October.
So maybe to Matt
colleagues, I would just note that it would have been great if we had this before we voted on the 2040 plan. This is the kind of data that some of us felt we should have been able to look at. But now we have it. That's good, and I'm done. Thank you.
Thank you. I was going to say also in response to Councilman Badrick's question, building on Matt. So Economic Planning and System has been working with a comprehensive plan consultant for the last 3 years, and they will continue through the rest of the process. So the same approach that you've seen today with the fiscal impact analysis, you're going to see that with the economic analysis and the UDO regulations as well. So what I will need from you, TAP members, is if we can have more than one TAP meetings, at least a month, because it's going to be a lot of heavy load over the next couple months. We do not want to give you finished product of the analysis. We would like to kind of walk you through so that way you have enough time and don't feel rushed. So I'll work with Lynn and Mayor Pro Tem to see when we can have further meetings. So Matt will be able to present some details, if you want, on some of this analysis going forward. And then Jay can connect that to the overall goal or the goals of the comprehensive plan for you. So I'll work, if that's okay, Mayor Pro Tem, I'll work with you and Lynn to see if we can have some other meetings that will provide you with further analysis of some of this, not just on this, but even also on the Silver Line project as well. Thank you.
Yeah, I definitely think that's a good idea, Taiwo. I appreciate that. I just want to make sure we have time to really get our questions in and understand what's happening. I do have a question.
Sure.
And then I'm going to drop off and turn it over to Vice Chair Eggleston to finish out the meeting. But when you identified Matt, the 7% of parcels that were vulnerable, I wonder, I don't know if this is a question for you really or for Ty, can we look at those parcels? You know, that's the first time we've gotten information about actual parcels. And is there a way to not protect them? I understand we can't protect individual property owners so much, but you know, what we can really do with tools that we have to offer protections to the most vulnerable lots, parcels.
Matt, maybe I can start. It's my expectation that the outcome of this, especially on that piece, will provide that information to the next committee, the commission that's working on neighborhood stabilization or anti-displacement, because that's where some of those findings will come. We have some of the tools in place today. Like we already started pilot programs for 3 communities like Hidden Valley. And my goal is that once we have those type of information, we'll provide it to a commission like NEST or Equitable Development Commission to see how can we tie the tools that they are proposing, whatever those will be in their findings, including existing tools, to really be able to mitigate displacement from the people who currently live in these areas. So that's really the best way I can answer that right now. So that way the results doesn't just stay with the plan, but it moves into the implementation piece.
Yeah, and we can, because we have identified those parcels, we can really further understand if the tools that we think we have, if they really can work, now that we know which parcels are vulnerable, and we can really understand the characteristics of that.
Yes.
Thank you. Larkin, go ahead if you want to. Thank you.
I believe that was the end of the presentations for today. So,
Mr. Chair, I move to close, to adjourn.
all right, I don't even know if we still have 3 members on?
Mr. Winston is still
Yes,
not.
I'm still on.
Okay, well then we can just go ahead and do that then. As you depart, and safe travels, Mayor Pro Tem.
Thank you.
Thank you to
Thanks,
everybody
everybody.
for presentations.